Let's start. So, hello everybody. Welcome to another two presentations that we will have ahead of the third panel discussion later today. I hope everybody enjoyed some delicious lunch. The first presentation will be held by Charlie Bedford-Forde, who is Head of Global Regulatory Reporting Solution Sales at S&P Global. Charlie has deep expertise in repo, securities lending, collateral management, transaction reporting, and post-trade services. And the title of the presentation will be Managed Services and Outsourcing. And Charlie, the stage is yours.
Thomas, thank you for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be here speaking with you this afternoon, and delighted to be at such a well-organised and well-attended conference. So, I'm going to take a few minutes this afternoon to speak to you on the topic of demystifying managed services. Managed services are words that we're hearing more and more, and something that runs alongside many of the different themes which are being considered here at the DKF conference. Importantly, managed services represent a material opportunity for firms big and small, especially across banking, financial services, and the insurance industries. Makes sense to start off with a high-level definition of what managed services are. So, these are the practice of outsourcing the responsibility for maintaining and anticipating need for a range of processes and functions for the purpose of improved operations and reduced budgetary expenditures through the reduction of directly employed staff. So I'd like to give you an idea of the size of the market that we are contemplating here today. We have this graphic from Fortune Business Insights, who have established that the annual value of the managed service space globally was just a tick under $220 billion per year in 2020, which increased by almost $25 billion last year, and is forecast to be worth over $557 billion by the end of 2028. Now, these are big numbers, and the growth rate here is forecast at over 12% on a compounded annual basis. Managed services are a rapidly growing market, and we're seeing new clients continuing to enter the space. There are a number of reasons for this, some of which we're going to explore this afternoon. A major factor is that barriers to leveraging these types of services were historically only available to the largest and most sophisticated companies have been reduced and removed, which means there are now tools that are able to deliver resources which represent fractions of full-time employees, outcome or deliverable-driven engagement, and flexible capacity across highly specialised fields to firms who might not have been able to acquire such services in the past. And the good news is that these services are making it better and easier to manage the hyper-specialised world that we now inhabit and the associated complexity, uncertainty, and fragmentation this brings. Timing-wise, there have been some recent developments that have complemented the rise in the availability of these services. So on this slide, you can see the quarterly job vacancy rates for both the EU and the Euro area over most of the last 10 years. And these numbers from Eurostat show that augmented capacity is hard to come by. One of the main reasons for this is that hiring and retaining talent has become increasingly difficult, with both workforce expectations changing dramatically over the last couple of years, obviously due to COVID. And it's not just mainland Europe that's experiencing this challenge. Just yesterday, it was announced in the UK that unemployment numbers are at a 50-year low at just 3.7%, with vacancies being massively outstripped by the number of people seeking work. So, the market's growing, but the supply of resources is not keeping up. So alongside the tight labour market that we just covered, it's worth adding that some of our sell-side clients have told us that they are struggling with between 30 and 50% attrition rates each year in certain functions. At the same time, clients, counterparties, colleagues, and of course management are increasingly demanding, and paradoxically, everybody is trying to do more with less. Companies are trying to stem the flow of IP leaving for all different reasons, ranging from retirement, staff being poached by competitors, or pursuing different opportunities. And we're seeing real challenges in the way in which juniors and graduates are integrated into the workforce and trained, which has, of course, accelerated during the pandemic. So we don't need to spend any real time on COVID, but the advent of mandatory home working resulted in an acceptance by senior management that people can be just as efficient, and often even more so, working remotely. And at the same time, from the staff perspective, we've all realised that flexibility is possible and certainly desirable, often even more preferable. And this shift has been facilitated by the fact that many of us can now use our own devices at home, and firms aren't having to supply double the number of devices. And in parallel, we have the maturation of cloud services and collaboration tools like Zoom and Teams and WebEx, which brings us on to digital transformation. Now, digital transformation has, of course, accelerated and compounded these changes and given companies new ways to better serve their customers and to differentiate themselves from their competitors. And against this backdrop, it's quite easy to see how the conditions have been created to support the explosion of outsourcing and managed services, and indeed to see why these markets are poised to continue to expand to over 550 billion by the end of 2028. So how does it work? In this section here, let's first have a look at what consultants have been traditionally used for. First off, providing insight, understanding market shifts and how peers are reacting to these. Secondly, delivering expertise and perspective. For example, obtaining a rubber stamp from a third party to validate a firm's particular approach to a regulatory change. And of course, adding capacity, whether this is on a seasonal or a temporary or a permanent basis. Looking at these in more detail, on the insight side, the industry has shifted from post-crisis austerity times, for now at least, into revenue realization mode, and we seem to have put cost-cutting as the main driver behind us. One of the key benefits of employing managed services is allowing firms to experiment in new areas and to scale business quickly when they're successful, or to cut their losses without any major investment or without having to add huge operations functions to the balance sheet. On the expertise side, a lot of the functions firms are having to manage are necessarily complex, and there can be real-world consequences for getting it wrong, ranging from fines to reputational damage, and even where the relevant teams working on these projects have the best of intentions. To give you an example, we can look at contentious fields within transaction reporting. If a firm is able to document that external advice was sought and followed in determining how to deal with a particular less than clear field from the regulators, which may or may not need to be reported, then you'll be able to tell your story if the regulator comes knocking. And finally, capacity. So there's two flavors of capacity from a managed service perspective. The first, managed process, is effectively using technology and resources to externalize and manage existing processes. And traditional augmentation is simply shipping in external headcount to work alongside existing teams. And the problem with this is it can be quite addictive, and these short-term additional employees can end up being in place for a really extended amount of time. The way in which firms leverage these external resources depends on the engagement model between the client and the supplier, and this is another place where we have been seeing a material shift. So, when firms are looking to add capacity, there are 6 different pillars that need to be considered, which we can think about using these questions. Where will the resources sit? What technology is going to be used? Who's managing the engagement? Who's accountable for the result? How does the supplier engage commercially? And what does the operational process look like? This is where you can see a gulf beginning to develop between the traditional resource augmentation and managed services. Traditional resource augmentation is a little bit funny in that the provider is incentivized to effectively land and expand, to get set up and then to continue increasing the number of bodies on the project or in the team, and then to stay there as long as possible. There is no incentive to reverse that. Whereas in these modern managed service engagements, providers are ultimately seeking to reduce costs, to use technology to solve problems, and then to reduce the number of heads that are required to support or enhance the business, allowing firms to then reinvest the cost savings into higher value activities. And there are obviously lots of different ways in which firms can leverage managed services. And to give you some concrete examples, I will take just a couple of moments to talk you through some of the ways in which we are partnering with our clients in this space. To echo the last point on the last slide, we are a tech provider with resources rather than a traditional consulting house. Now, why is this important? We are incentivized to improve our clients' processes using tech first, rather than becoming an integral part of your workforce. What do? So it's not the case that we have tech and data and expertise for all problems. We're very focused in how we engage with our clients. At the heart of it, we supply 4 things: world-class execution, unique technology and data, cost synergies, and deep domain expertise. As I said, we don't do this for everything. We specialize in 4 areas. The first is tax, whether this is in collecting withholding or return reporting needs, or helping firms to comply with FATCA or CRS. It is in client onboarding and KYC processes, supporting all different sorts of requirements, whether these relate to new client onboardings, existing client refresh projects, or remediation, both on a bilateral and a multilateral due diligence basis. Regulatory, and by this I mean helping clients manage regulatory change and adherence with new requirements, whether this is supporting the exchange of documentation or modified terms of businesses, or adjusting target operating models to be able to cope with new regimes or rewrites and refits to existing regimes. And finally, we cover third-party risk management, so helping firms to lighten the burden of due diligence monitoring and critical risk remediation across all different types of vendors to manage onboarding assessments, change management, ongoing oversight, reporting, and giving firms transparency across their entire vendor network. So, in the interest of leaving some time for questions, I will skip over a further plug for S&P services. But if you'd like to talk to us about this afterwards, then look out for me, for Tom, for Isabel, and of course, we'll be at the drinks later.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. Do we have any questions here? Yes, please wait a second for the microphone, so we have this recorded.
Hello, Matthias Koch, DWS. Got one question, Charlie, or 2 questions actually. Right page on the cost synergies, as you're saying that reducing ops costs as the relationship continues. Can you explain what that means? Does it mean lesser cost reductions at the start, and the longer you're with your organization, the more you can save?
Well, that's often the case, Matthias. Of course, at the setup stage, there are going to be more human resources involved in the project as processes are shifted from completely manual, as they might be today, to fully automated. And so the number of staff required to support these different efforts will reduce over time. That's the intention here.
Thank you. And the second question is about the cloud. Very hip. On-site versus cloud solutions. What about the trend, what you see from customers? Not to say that we are planning to hand something out to a cloud yet, as it is always a bit suspicious still. But what do you see? What's your advice?
So it's a really good question, Matthias, and I think the shift to cloud is part of that digital transformation that has supported the rise and the advent of these managed services. And generally, when we're talking cloud, we're talking externally provided cloud services. It's not the case that an individual firm is spinning up their own bespoke cloud network or private cloud. It's generally through partnerships with firms like AWS or Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud. And even 5 years ago, most firms didn't have a policy or an information security team that was capable of assessing and managing the risks and the due diligence exercises required to be able to get comfortable with critical processes being put into third-party tech. The last few years, and of course with COVID, there's been a huge acceleration in willingness to engage on these kinds of models, and the sorts of functions that are now being outsourced to third-party providers are almost entirely, they're across the entire value chain of financial services. Even highly sensitive private individual information such as passport details for traders under MiFID, for example, can now be managed through cloud engagements, and there are the right, robust frameworks in place to give firms comfort that this highly sensitive information isn't going to fall into the wrong hands. And even further than that, there are managed services providers who provide the penetration testing and the functionality to test these cloud engagements to ensure the robustness remains, and that should any vulnerabilities be identified, they can be quickly addressed.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks. Do we have any other questions? Doesn't seem so. I guess then we are through. Thanks for your attendance.
Thank you, Thomas.
And thank you, Charlie, again. And yeah, we have another presentation in this room. It will be in German in about 10 minutes or so. Thank you.